Okay, so one book which you've mentioned to me a number of times that has a bit influence on you, Atomic Habits. What are your thoughts on that? How have you applied to your real life? Or rather, what's like the key number one takeaways of the book for you, and how have you applied that to your life?
Okay. I think I'd answer it a bit differently, if that's okay. For me, because
sure.
for me, I would say I was actually doing a lot of the atomic stuff organically. As you said, when you met me, you felt I had a wide range of interests. And I think the advice in Atomic Habits is needed to have a wide range of interests. And I'll get to that in a second. But I think what Atomic Habits really gave me is a language to express what I'm doing to other people. I didn't have the ability to say, when someone said, wow, you're doing so many things, I didn't have the ability to articulate how I'm doing it. I think Atomic Habits empowered me to tell my friends, oh, this is what you can do. And it gave me a better model when I'm adding new things into my life to add them in effectively. So that's the one way I'll change it. But to answer your actual question, I think the two things are I think it's a Kaizen, the 1% change, where when he has the British cycling team in the example, you read the book,
Yep.
the case study in the beginning where they just improve everything by the British cycling team, every aspect by 1%, and then the whole team becomes the best.
Oh, marginal gains.
Yeah,
is
the
big
marginal
one.
gains, exactly. So small compound interest, marginal gains, that really touched me. So I'm learning Korean now. I don't think, I need to be fluent in Korean by tomorrow. I just think, let me just be consistent, 30 minutes a day of practice. This is going to be mind blowing. But me, the me 1 year in the future is going to be so much better than me now at speaking Korean.
Yeah.
Just by having those small incremental gains. But also the reverse. I think if you don't improve something, it will get worse and worse. So I think that's a big thing.
I think that reverse is often not considered.
Yeah, I think that's huge as well. So what am I doing that's making myself worse, or what am I not doing? So let's say I'm not training, or what am I doing? Am I eating junk food? And then the opposite. What can I do to constantly improve? And whenever I see a big task, I don't think that's impossible. I just think let me just break it down into chunks.
Nice. I like this. This is
Yeah.
100% one of my favorite things of the to-do list is just break it down to the
Yeah.
smallest possible thing.
And I think because I've read so many books, we've read so many chats, I can't remember what's Atomic Habits and what's not Atomic
Fair.
Habits.
Yeah,
but
yeah. Feel free to.
what I've done, and this maybe you can correct me. This isn't from the book. Is when I pick up a new hobby, the first thing I check is how far is it from where I live. If it's not within a 30-minute commute, I know I won't stick to it. So I think unless I'm obsessed, anything that's not within a particular radius, commutable radius, I'm just not going to pick up because I'm not going to stick to it. Unless, like I said, unless I'm really curious and it's the only option. So that's one thing I sort of gained from that book, but I don't know if that book advises that or if I just picked that up somehow from the book. Another thing I think is habit stacking. So doing doing things in a certain order. So when I wake up, I make sure I do this. I have my clothes ready the night before. Building certain systems in place.
I spoke to someone recently who has very strong ADHD, and he said this was, habit stacking or trying to like group habits together that he would normally get distracted from. It's one of the biggest ways he's stuck to a lot of different health goals. For instance, so instead of thinking, in the morning I've got to take vitamin D, I've got to take X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, I've got to take my supplements as like one group and making it as easy as possible to take them all together rather than it be like 7 different jars or whatever.
You just reminded me what I was trying to think of. So when it was logistics, it wasn't I think what I got from the book was making it as easy as possible. Whatever I need to do, I just minimize, rather than thinking, how can I do it? I'm thinking, what's stopping me from doing it and taking those. And I actually learned more from his newsletter after the book, maybe than even, I think his newsletter is fantastic. I mean, it's one of the best newsletters I've subscribed to. One of the few I make sure to read and pay attention to. And it's more that I'm taking away things. So, like you said, rather than, because I take about loads of supplements too, so maybe you can put them all in a box and it's got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and you take it all in one go. You made it easier rather than unboxing each one every time. But one caveat to play devil's advocate is I'm not actually that into habits as a concept. I really want to live consciously. So I don't want to do, even if it's a good thing, I don't want to do it compulsively. So I'm naturally a bit resistant to the habit. And this is a personal thing. This is not a...
Okay, this is super interesting. Yeah. Why is that?
So I'm personally I don't want to think in the habit stacking structure because I want every decision, every breath, every thought, every act I do to be a conscious act. And habit by its nature is compulsive and unconscious. Even if it's a good habit, the fact that I'm not thinking about it is something I don't want to be. I want to make every choice a conscious choice, just because I'm very into yoga and meditation.
Could you not still make a habit conscious, and maybe in some ways that is the obstacle to overcome? Is to do something which is habit, which is compulsive, but still do it in a conscious way.
Because I guess and once again, maybe this is more of a definitions discussion. I guess when I think of habit, I think it's like it's almost programmed. I don't think I just wake up, brush my teeth. I'm not thinking. So I guess anything that's in that nature, even if it's beneficial, like brushing my teeth is beneficial to me, it's just not something I'm looking to cultivate. I'm not saying that I don't behave habitually. Obviously, I'm a human being,
Yep.
but I'm striving to live where everything is I would like to be where every breath I'm conscious of. I'm not saying this is how I live, just to be clear.
100%.
So that's why I kind of shy away from the habit stacking philosophy, because it's not what I'm trying to cultivate.
Do you have an example, or a counterintuitive example of something that you maybe haven't done that generally people would have thought is good, but you're actually like, no, this does not fit my value set of wanting to live more consciously in these sorts of areas?
I think trying to program things as habits. So I'm constantly trying to habit breaks. When I wake up, the first thing I do is I'm having a shower, and all of a sudden I make it cold. Just because it's not saying no cell in my body is saying make this water cold. Nothing in me wants this to happen. Or waking up 2 hours earlier to do a complex physical yoga and breathing technique pattern, which I have to be completely focused on. Or before you eat, you wait 10 seconds before you eat. Instinct is to grab the food. So it's constant pattern breaking. It's part of the Eastern style, because there's something called karma, which translates as memory or action. And they say if you behave out of your karma, it's like you're compulsively behaving. So they say, like in the traditional Indian medicinal view, or like you have like the astrologers that predict your life, and this whole style. And the claim is that because of your karmic patterns, they can predict from patterns. And anyone on the spiritual path, in theory, you shouldn't be able to predict them, because you can't predict a conscious being, because they're just responding, and they're not reacting, they're responding. So these are just stories. I'm not saying
These are super interesting. Do you have other examples of how someone could pattern break? And what's interesting is immediately in my head, I was going to ask the question, is there any way that you can create a habit of pattern breaking? Which is like in itself maybe a bit counterintuitive, but also could definitely help with things around like, using social media, or just these other sorts of behaviors that we don't necessarily want to reduce to zero, but we potentially want to reduce. And oftentimes it just comes to habitually scrolling onto Instagram, and you just find yourself on Instagram. Whereas if you get into a habit of pattern breaking, maybe you have a bit more conscious control over that.
So another one is, whenever you speak, whatever you're about to say, can you say it in 50% fewer words? That's another one. Can you just minimize gossiping? You only speak when you need to speak. It's a bit boring now, that one. But having a break before eating, waiting to eat, maybe not eating whilst watching TV. You eat completely in silence, just completely focus on the food. Giving complete attention to someone. So normally when I'm talking to someone at a party and there's a pretty girl walking past, and I'll force myself to give my friend undivided attention, even though every cell of my being is saying, I want to go talk to this cute girl, whatever, that's standing there at the party. I think the complex, very specific complex yoga practices in the morning, which you do not want to do when you wake up. When that alarm rings at 5 a.m., you're like, why am I doing this? So I think that is one other one. Eating in a particular way. And also another thing is, in this tradition, there's a whole diet. It's called a sattvic diet. There's a whole way of eating that makes it conducive for this way of living as well.
What would be that sort of diet?
There's no onion, no garlic, no chili, no caffeine, no alcohol. 50% raw food if you can. So fresh food. If you're a monk, you probably have more raw food, maybe 90 to 100% raw food. There was one more example I wanted to give. I can't remember what it was now.
And when you've been on various like ashrams, silent retreats also, if I'm understood correctly, at these places, do you tend to eat this diet? And what is that?
You have to eat a diet. Yeah, and your sleep quota will go down significantly. Your ability to sit in stillness will go down.
Your sleep quota will go down.
Yeah, because when it comes to diet, we diet for different reasons. So let's say if I wanted to become a bodybuilder, I would eat in a particular way. That doesn't mean that diet is better or worse than another diet. That diet may not be good for your health, but it'll be great for looking amazing, assuming a bodybuilder is what you consider to be an amazing look. Then for the yogic lifestyle, there's a desire to sit in stillness for long periods of time. And due to this, they've over the years have discovered, or I don't know how, but they've said these are the foods that we suggest if you want to do this. This makes your body most conducive for that experience.
Most conducive to sitting for long periods.
Long periods of stillness, being receptive to deep inner experiences, sleeping less. What the studies are on this, the modern studies, I don't know. But according to the yogic system, this is the diet. That's the same called Ayurveda, which is traditional Indian medicine. Another version called Siddha. And then there's yoga. And within these, they have what they propose. How much this aligns with modern research, I'm not clear on. I'm not up to date on that. But they propose this with the intent that if you want to live this particular lifestyle, it's not an ethical diet. It's not, you don't eat meat because meat is bad for you. You know, according to their system, vegetables, a plant still competes for survival. A plant reproduces, or, you know, differently, of course. A plant breathes. A plant fights for resources. It competes for sun. You put two trees and they'll compete. So it's not a question of ethics. It's just that for this system, we've discovered that this food is the most conducive for what you want to do. I wanted to bring another point on the pattern breaking, is even sitting in a particular way. So obviously we're sitting in chairs now. Whereas if I was in India, I would sit cross-legged in a very particular way, because even your body language indicates your conscious state. For example, if I have a blind person, their body language will be the same as a person with vision if they have a certain emotion. You know, a blind person crosses their arms. They've never seen someone crossing their arms. They haven't learned that from watching, right? So certain states of consciousness are mimicked by a certain state of your body and your body language. But the inverse is true as well. If you hold your body in a certain state, after a while your conscious state will also change. For example, you have the common business advice to put your hands akimbo before going to a meeting.
Oh, the power pose.
The power pose.
Power poses.
So the same way the system of yoga have identified particular poses where if you hold them for a significant amount of time, it raises your consciousness. So that's where that logic comes from. Also, the breathing techniques. If someone is angry, what's the first thing you say to them? Take a deep breath. You don't need to be a trained psychologist to say take a deep breath. So on the other hand, there's also an assumption that there's a link between your breath and your mental structure. So the breathing techniques are very important as well. Another reason why I wanted to fix my broken nose, because I couldn't do the practices. So that's another form of pattern breaking, is the practices themselves have a way of breaking these patterns. So that's why, long convoluted story, I'm not that into the habit stacking stuff, but I think it's really cool, and I think it's obviously effective.
But no, it's interesting touching more on the yogic ashram aspect. In terms of your first interest in, let's say, yogic practices broadly defined, where did that come from? Was it just yourself? Was there a family aspect? And then also, what was the thing that made you want to do something fairly extreme, like a silent retreat?
So I think you're familiar with the hero's journey.
But
yeah, okay. So
definitely
for those that don't know, so the hero's journey is a common formula that many stories go by, where there's a hero who lives in a village. Something will happen to force that hero to leave their village. Some drastic calamity. Say Luke Skywalker lives in Tatooine. The Empire comes, kill his aunt and uncle. Yes, and I'll leave. He will usually find a mentor, a wizard of some kind. Obi-Wan. Luke finds Obi-Wan. Then he'll be trained for some time. He'll fight the villain, and he'll probably lose. Which happens. Luke loses his hand. He loses. He'll then go back to complete his training, further training. He then beats the villain. Luke beats Darth Vader. He goes back to where he came from, and he's happily ever after. What doesn't happen in Star Wars, but usually happens, is he'll get a love interest or he'll get loads of wealth. And with those additions, he then goes back to where he came from, but now he's in elevated status. So he left where he came from, he comes back, they're the same, but he or she is now higher. I can't remember this exact formula, but something maybe you remember better than I do. What I found so unique about Star Wars, and to me as a young child, Luke Skywalker was the coolest ever, is that the hero was a monk. He had no love interest and no wealth. But to me, he was the coolest character ever. So that didn't make sense. Back then, I didn't care about women or money when I was 7. But as you got older, of course, I cared about, finding an attractive partner who I really resonate with, having wealth, having financial freedom. All these things are important to many people. But still, somewhere in my head, as I was aging, I felt the coolest character as a monk. What am I missing? And of course, Luke meditates, and Luke finds a teacher. There's the two things that's really important in Star Wars, the Jedi, is that they have a teacher. They do inner practices as much as they do external practices. You see Luke doing gymnastics, you see Luke training with the lightsaber, but you also see him meditating and being in stillness. And in that universe, that's seen as just as important, or if not more important, than the external work. If anything, the inner work sort of empowers the external. So from this, I thought, how can I become like this? I didn't realize that Star Wars was actually based on Japanese cinema back then. Jedi wear kimono. They have swords. Darth Vader has samurai armor. There's an emperor as a shogun.
So what is it? What is Star Wars based off / inspired by?
It's called Akira Kurosawa, which is a very famous Japanese director. And George Lucas fell in love with Japanese cinema. And this is not a theory. He admits this. This is all outspoken by him himself. And then this heavily inspired this guy's films. Maybe more Japanese cinema, but especially Akira Kurosawa's work. He made Seven Samurai, very famous film. Really recommend his films. Anyway, so this was very cool because you basically have this Eastern story masquerading as a sci-fi film. You have the space wizard samurai monk as the main character, like this Buddhist monk traveling around. So that triggered me in a way that I knew that I had to find some way of going inwards, or I would never be as cool as my hero. Subconsciously that somehow stayed in my head. And then so I got into gymnastics because the Jedi do cool acrobatics. Got into martial arts.
What age are we talking now?
Now I was probably 15, 14, so maybe a bit younger. Got into gymnastics, learned backflips, all these cool things. Then I learned martial arts. I was into sword fighting as well, but I think just hand-to-hand martial arts is a bit more accessible, and you don't really walk around with a sword anymore. So I got into martial arts, like kung fu, then eventually into jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, wrestling, boxing. But then the part of me was always seeking some inner practice, and because I'm half Indian, I'm quite exposed to Hinduism and Buddhism. So naturally, I started reading about Buddhist texts.
When you say you're exposed to Hinduism and Buddhism, is it both equally, one more than the other?
I would say Hinduism a bit more, but they're so close in India. It's so intertwined that it's not like here where you have Christianity, Catholicism, Islam. There are places where it is really like that, but a lot of Indian culture is like it's all blended.
That's really
depends. Some people you speak to, they will be very hardcore.
Yep.
But there are many pockets where it's just like, oh, you're just seeking enlightenment. I don't care how you find it. That's like the vibe.
I like that.
Whatever it takes. One guy worships a cow, one guy worships a stone, one guy worships the sun, but all they really care about is breaking their karma in some way, breaking compulsive patterns. That's what they're trying to seek. And because the British colonized India, it became more structured as religions, but originally these were all practices, right? You'd have to find a teacher in person. He or she would teach you, initiate you into a practice. You then do these breathing techniques. It wasn't that, oh, I believe this and now I'm happy. You have to strive and work to some... Perception was the most important quality. You need to perceive more than you perceive now. Anyway, so I was getting into this, but then I didn't have a live teacher. And there's someone who's very famous on YouTube now called Sadhguru. So before he was famous, as he is now, he did a live talk. And I went to his live talk and I just said, whatever you're doing, I have to do. So I do not care. Whatever practice you tell me to sit in silence for 10 days. I just realized that I was like Luke finally finding Yoda. So I have to do this. And then did a 7-day program and I hated every second.
Oh, really?
What am I doing here, man?
And 7 days of...
Like sitting cross-legged, doing breathing techniques, listening to videos about food and how to just like uncovering your mental processes and different things like this. And then you get initiated into a practice. And then I was really struggling. I couldn't sit cross-legged on the floor. I was always angry. But then before I knew it, I went to the bottom of my school grades, the top of my school grades in 6 months. Because all the yoga practices work on the base of your spine and your neurosensory system flows through your spine. So I think the combination of the breathing techniques and building up my system sort of awakened. And actually the imagery of yoga is a lotus on blossoming, right? So somehow that's just because it's all in the spine or health. All the classical yoga practices. I'm not talking about gym yoga. I've never done yoga in a gym in my life. This is a classical form of yoga where there's a...
What would you call this classical form of yoga?
So the whole...
If someone wanted to like YouTube it afterwards.
Yeah, so this particular lineage is called Isha Yoga. But within Isha Yoga, they're teaching two types. One is called Hatha Yoga. Ha means sun and moon. You might see the yin and yang, masculine and feminine. So in yoga, it's very important that as a human being, your masculine and feminine are balanced. A lot of the imageries of a sun and a moon, the yin and yang, a man and a female half for each. And that was very important from a spiritual perspective. I'm not talking about business. I'm not talking about dating. That's different. But in terms of you... If I'm not interacting with anyone else, in the yoga system, I should be masculine and feminine balance. Maybe if I'm courting a woman, I might amp up the masculinity. Maybe if I'm making a pitch to a business. But within yourself, there's no one looking, you're by yourself, you should be balanced. That's the goal. So that's called the Hatha, and that's the physical postures. And most of Western yoga will be an offshoot of this Hatha, where you do poses and stuff.
Gotcha.
Then there's the Kriya Yoga. Kriya is opposite of the word karma.
On that first one, would you say some of these poses are difficult, physically demanding in some way? Maybe they require like at least some degree of flexibility. But when you do them, are they the ones that you would be able to do for a significant amount of time with stillness, or would they be more kind of movement based?
So there's different. So my total practice takes 5 hours. So there's a lot of variety. But I usually alternate practices. There are some practices I have to do every day. Some I will alternate. Some I only do if I have time. So some of them are more movement based, more dynamic, more like a fitness routine that you'd imagine. But using the geometry is very important. Like how you stand, how you sit. Even my fingers like this. Every detail is looked at. Then there are some where you hold postures at the most 3 minutes. You wouldn't hold for that long. For the long durations, you'll be sitting cross-legged or sitting on your shins. You know how Japanese people sit. It's called Vajrasana. Or you sit in a cross-leg posture, it's called Ardha Siddhasana. So for the longer period, you'll be sitting in a meditative posture. When you're holding the postures, it'll be a bit more dynamic. You're going through a very, very particular detailed sequence. It wouldn't be random. Because the sequence of the postures is how the system activates itself. Every detail is looked at. It's not like, I feel like doing this posture because my shoulder hurts. No, you do the whole sequence. This is the classical style, right? This is very different too. So all the health things like my back pain, my shoulder pain, my brain becoming more competent, all these things are byproducts. The main thing is you're doing these practices for a particular purpose, and all the health benefits. It's like using a plane to drive to your school. Yes, a plane can be used to fix your back pain, to drive to your school, using the metaphor, but the plane is actually designed to take you off. But as a but you do all these other things are byproducts. But the main thing of yoga is that you're becoming a conscious being. Like every decision is your choice. There's actually a really good story with the Buddha. He's walking, and supposedly he had a nice, because like I said, the feminine, masculine, he has a gentle gait about him. His walk is very pleasant. And these Hindu priests saw this beautiful man walking, the Buddha, and they said, "Oh, you're such a great, graceful human being. Why don't you join us in our prayers?" And he said, "What prayers are you doing?" "We're praying to get to heaven." He's like, "What is this heaven you speak of?" "There's no problems. Everything is taken care of. You'll be completely happy. You don't need to worry about anything." He said, "In that case, teach me a prayer to get to hell." I was like, "Why?" He's like, "At least there I can make a difference." but the point of the story is that he's decided he's in a blissful state, so it doesn't matter where he is. That's the point. That's the parable, is that he's not looking for an external situation to feel like in heaven. It's within him. He's decided he's going to be like this. And that's the point of being a conscious being, that you decide your experience of life. And ironically, then you can actually help people.
Yep.
If you're fighting your own brain every day, how are you going to want to help anyone else? So I thought it was a really cool story.
That's an interesting point, because I was having a discussion with a friend recently who they were specifically talking about their received view of Buddhism. Their received view of Buddhism was that it was quite insular, quite introverted, and that people were very pushed along the monastic path. My view was that that wasn't the case, and that the monastic path, in some ways similar to Christianity, is a certain aspect of the religion, but it's not necessarily how it would be day to day. They still have families and procreate and all these other kind of quote unquote normal things that are not traditionally monk-like. How would that potentially fit into what you're saying? And then we can go back to these different aspects of yoga, which is...
Just to clarify, I'm talking about the Buddha from a perspective of someone into yoga, not as a Buddhist practitioner. So I'm not a Buddhist as a religious follower.
Yep.
For me, the Buddha is an example of a yogi in history. A yogi is someone who's... So the word Buddha buddhi means intellect, and da means beyond. So Buddha's a title, it's not his name. His name is Gautama, right?
Yep.
But his title is Buddha because he's living beyond...
How did you pronounce it there? In my head, it was, Siddhartha Gautama.
I don't know. Siddhartha Gautama. I don't know.
Gautama.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know.
Oh, interesting. I heard a different pronunciation.
I don't know. I would say Gautama.
Gautama.
But I'm not from Nepal, so I don't know. I don't know how the Nepalese would... I don't know, is he from Nepal or a bit below? I'm not sure which part of India he's from. Yeah, I don't know the correct pronunciation of his name. But anyway, that's not his name is not Buddha, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. Wait, how do you pronounce it? How do you say it?
Siddhartha, which I think, as I say it out loud...
I think it's anglicized.
It sounds... Immediately as I said it out loud, sounds anglicized. But in my head, it was Siddhartha Gautama. But...
That's the anglicized version. So I'll say Siddhartha Gautama. That's
interesting.
Yeah. But then we're speaking English, so...
Yeah, for sure. But it was nice to add that.
Yeah. It's like, someone that says that one French word in a strong French accent.
Yeah, exactly.
Chill out, big man. Yeah, so I'm not coming at this from a Buddhist practitioner perspective. And also Buddhism spread all over Asia. I don't know if you know the monk who brought it to Asia. His name is Bodhidharma. He brought martial arts to China as well. That's why they do Kung Fu. He brought martial arts from South India to China because the monks were getting fat. And then...
This monk is also the same monk behind is the Dhammapada? Or...
I don't know.
Oh, okay. No worries. I don't want to interrupt this point.
Yeah. Anyways, so I see the Buddha as an example of what a being on the yogic path can be. I'm not following Buddhism as...
After a quick memory card break, we're back. And the question is... Monks, yoga.
Yeah.
We briefly touched on Buddhism. You can either continue the point around Buddhism or you can go into the different parts of yoga.
Yeah. So I'll quickly finish the monk. So one thing is interesting is that monks are differently seen in the East than they are in the West. In the East, they're seen as giving. In the West, they're seen as giving up something. In the East, they're seen as transcending something. That they've had a deep experience of some divine experience, some blissful state. They're so greedy that they won't settle for lower pleasures. They want the biggest pleasure. So a monk...
And would it be defined as a pleasure in that sense?
When it's not that a pleasure is maybe higher perception, they're in a certain state, that in that state a byproduct of blissfulness and pleasure might be there. There are states called samadhi. So the Buddha actually discarded these states. He said these are also just things you get attached to. He went through all these states. You may hear of monks who live in the Himalayas for years without eating, without drinking. There are even some documentaries on these people. So these are called different states of samadhi. But my point is they've had such a deep experience, whatever it is. I've not experienced it, so I'm only speaking from what I've gleaned information, not from experience, which is always something I try to avoid. But what I'm trying to say is that a monk in the West and the East are very different. A monk in the East is someone that they want this because it's they don't want anything else to distract them. They want that. Whereas in the West, I guess I'm not saying how it is for the monks in the West, but I think how society treats monks in the West is they've given up something, they've renounced something. Whereas no, in the East, they're just so greedy that only the peak pleasure settles them. Because that's a very different narrative of looking at it. So I just wanted to clarify that. And the Buddha's disciples, from what I knew, they were all monks when he was alive, and they couldn't stay in one area for any period of time. I can't remember, maybe longer than a week or something. They had to always leave. They had to travel always, all his disciples, and that also helped Buddhism to spread. There's a fun story of one of his monks meeting a prostitute. I don't know if you know that.
No.
It's really cool. I don't want to say too many stories, but I'll just quickly...
Maybe let's dive into the story.
Okay, so in the monsoon season was the one exception where the Buddha's disciples, or his monks, were allowed to stay in one period of place. And this monk was staying in this town. I can't remember the exact details. And then a courtesan or some prostitute type lady was offered to host him. And the other monks think, oh man, he's going to stay in a prostitute's house? Is that, or courtesan, whatever she is, something of this nature, her house? Is this really, really wise?
So this story of a Buddha.
Yeah.
Okay. The story about the Buddha's disciple.
And the courtesan. So the Buddha's disciples, they were monks, and that part of that was begging for food. So it's part of the rule that they wouldn't be a burden to villages and towns. They would have to constantly be on the move, except during the monsoon, when it's rainy, it's hard to navigate through the jungles. So one of these disciples, I can't remember his name, he was staying in this town and he was begging for alms. And he was a tall, beautiful, handsome man in the story. And this courtesan comes up to him and says, "Hey, do you want to stay in my home during this monsoon season?" And he says, "Oh, I have to ask the Buddha first." He said, "Oh, you have to ask your guru? Okay." He's like, "Yes, I do." So he went to ask. He said, "This lady's invited me to her home." And the other monks were like, What the heck? His spirituality is crumbling. What is this? And then the Buddha said, "No, you stay with this lady. She's invited you home. What's wrong?" So he goes to her house. And then throughout this time, all the other monks are whispering, "Oh, he's lost it. He's gone. That's it. He's no longer going to be on the path." And then she gives him a shawl because he's a bit cold. They're all whispering, "What's this? What's this?" She cooks for him. Normally they're just getting whatever they can get from their begging bowls, but she makes him a nice meal. They think that's it. He's gone. He's no longer going to be on this path. But he's carried on as normal. Then she dances and performs for him, and he watches just with utmost attention, looking at her dance. And all this happens. They're all losing faith in him. And then they complain to the Buddha, saying, "What is this? How can we let this happen?" Said, "Well, what was important to me on the spiritual path is whatever's the most powerful and effective, that's what we do. If what she's doing is more powerful and effective, even I would go to her for her services. But I believe what I'm doing is the most effective way."
Right.
So you let him go. And later on,
like that.
Yeah, and later on, two monks come back, him and the lady. So she becomes a monk as well. By the end of the story, they thought he would stop being a monk.
I like that.
But she comes back, shaved head with the robes. So he leaves a monk in the courtesan, and two monks come back. So that's a cool story. But the reason why I brought the story up was onto the monk monastic life, and in the East, it was always seen as a great thing to become a monk. Actually, without the monks, when a spiritual master dies, say the Buddha were to die, or Sadhguru were to die now, or any of these yogis or Buddhas in history, it's the monks that keep the culture alive. It's thanks to the monks we're talking about meditation today, not thanks to the Buddha. It's the monks that spread it everywhere. I mean, of course, thanks to someone like the Buddha. So the monks are so integral to the spiritual movement staying alive. So that's why they're seen as so important in these societies. And actually, at one point in ancient India, 30% of the population were monks. But to answer your original question, whether Buddhism pushes monastic life, I don't know, because I'm not a Buddhist practitioner. I'm only coming at this approach from a yoga perspective and seeing him as a yogi in history. But definitely monks were revered, and they were seen as, they were just one-track mind. It's like, you have a long process to get somewhere, or you can go there as fast as possible. So that's what the monks were about, and preserving the culture for future generations. So that doesn't really answer your question. I don't know how it is in.
No, that makes sense. That's really interesting.
But
I think it's more interesting to hear your perspective on the yogi view on it, rather than necessarily that Buddhist specifically. Yeah. Cool. So we spoke about a courtesan, or however we define them.